So in this video, I'm going to be discussing Isaiah 6, 1 through 7. So Isaiah 6, 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on the throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Alright, so King Uzziah might have died between 742 and 735 BC. The hem refers to the lower portion of a robe that would have been stylized in ancient times and would have been significant to the wearer's identity. The robe that God wears is different in that it does not fit inside the temple. For Isaiah and the Israelites, this image might have been a confirmation of God's glory, as well as a possible subtext that God was really in the temple. The ancient world did not have passports. Rather, people would have been asked to present their seal and hem of the robe as proof of identity. Isaiah's account is also significant because Isaiah understands God to have assumed the form of a human. This event would be called a theophany, where a deity chooses to manifest before a human. Generally, God does not do this in the Old Testament. This is extremely rare. God is also anthropomorphized, meaning that God either chose to appear similar in likeness to a human, or Isaiah described God like a human. Isaiah's account stands out for its willingness to anthropomorphize God. Isaiah's mention of seraphs in Isaiah 6, 2-7, which I'll now read, is such. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to the other and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Isaiah 6, 4. The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. Alright, so Isaiah 6, 2, there's a pretty big contention between modern scholarship and Hellenistic Neoplatonism that influenced early church theological doctrine. So modern scholarship points to seraphs as winged cobras that would have come from the Egyptian tradition that scholars can trace back to the art that still exists today, whereas the theological tradition originated from a writer known only as Psuedo-Dionysus the Areopagite. The writer was extremely influential in early medieval biblical scholarship, as the writer was thought to be Dionysus the Areopagite, and this person was mentioned in Acts as an apostle of Paul. Modern scholars have subsequently found that the writer's style would have been heavily influenced by the Neoplatonist philosophical movement sometime after 500 AD, well after the historical person would have died. The account is called the Celestial Hierarchy and was written by the same source and organizes angels into a hierarchy that had an extremely prominent influence on Christianity's view of angels and divine beings found in the Bible. These writings were later adopted into other church doctrine and teachings, most notably the writings of Thomas Aquinas. These views are not mutually compatible, but still important to one's understanding of Isaiah 6. The theological views of Pseudo-Dionysus on seraphim are that the seraphim are a class of angel that outrank all other angels. The reason for this classification is because their name, as he understood it, referenced fire, and he understood the seraphim to be the ones who burn. Second, the passage in Isaiah mentions that the 2 seraphim, or the seraphs, proclaim the glory of God to one another. Pseudo-Dionysus held that the powerful angels would be those that continually praised God above all else. This is Pseudo-Dionysus' viewpoint concerning the seraphs. However, Pseudo-Dionysus very likely wrote his hierarchy not to teach, but rather imitate the rites of a mystery religion. Mystery religions originated in some fashion from ancient Greece, where chosen people would have been inducted by means of religious rites where the mystery of a god would have been revealed to individuals. Pseudo-Dionysus seems to have been a member of one of these mystery cults and was likely imitating the nature of these mystery religions by writing in an intentionally vague way. In his own way, the writer may have been trying to induct readers into a new mystery religion of his own creation. Modern scholarship debate holds that the seraphs are thought to have originally been thought of as winged serpents that came from Egypt. Their connotation at the time this section of Isaiah is very difficult to discern. However, Israelites of the day would have been familiar with seraphs. Several seals with winged serpents similar in likeness had been dated back to the time of the 8th century BC Judah. At some point, the seraphs would have been associated with the throne. It cannot be said for sure if these seraphim would have only protected divine thrones and temples, or if they could be thought to have protected mortal thrones and palaces. In Isaiah 6:2, the seraphs are described as covering their faces with their wings. Calvin understands this to be a direct estimation of how brilliant God's presence would have been. Calvin used Pseudo-Dionysus' prevailing theory for reference to the hierarchy of angelic beings. Calvin terms the seraphim as being extremely powerful and yet were not able to look directly at God. In J.J.M. Roberts' introduction and commentary for the NRSV edition of Isaiah, he mentions that this may have referred to blindness. This may mean that God may have also been too much to gaze at, regardless of what type of being happened to do so. This passage may also be another confirmation of the brilliance and greatness that God's presence brings. Lastly, in this section, it is worth mentioning that Isaiah is not blinded. Isaiah's account here is confusing, for the account repeatedly gives markers for the glory of God that Isaiah is unaffected by. Alright, so Isaiah 6:3. And one called to the other and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The singing here of praises for God may have been the general meaning for the importance of praising only one God. This idea is called monolatry, which is the worship of only God, only one God, without denying the existence of other deities. This interpretation could very well be the case, as Isaiah and much of the Old Testament deal very heavily with the consequences of idolatry. Another interpretation of Isaiah 6:3 comes from the analysis of Pseudo-Dionysus, in which he says the seraphs are thought to be understood as angels that proclaim the glory of God, and when they do this, the entire earth is filled with their praises. Isaiah 6:4. The pivots on the threshold shook at the voices of those who called, and the house is filled with smoke. Calvin's commentary states that the use of smoke was not uncommon in temple rituals of Israel and Judah. Calvin also notes that smoke is often used as a sign of God's power. He reasons that the smoke may represent God's signal to quiet the hubris of man. I think it could be that the case is that God intentionally uses smoke to separate divinity from the affairs of man. Calvin states that it could have been God's intention to make man fear God. The intangibility of God's power is well represented by smoke. Again, the hazy and unconquerable nature of smoke is a small yet versatile allusion to the awesome might intended to be portrayed by Isaiah's temple theophany account. Isaiah 6:5. And I said, Woe is me! I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Isaiah's profession of sin is part of a ritual of purity regarding the sacred. Unclean or impure things and substances were barred from entering the temple. Ritual purification predates the Israelite temple and was common in most ancient religious rituals. Blenkinsop states the following about Isaiah 6:5. The attribution of holiness to God, the Holy One of Israel, and the Holy God, implies not so much the ethical character of Yahweh, which is not a major concern for Isaiah, as absolute transcendent otherness. The reaction of Isaiah in the temple vision illustrates how, on this view of reality, Sin is understood not so much in the act of ethical reflection as rather in the awareness of this reality of these other breaking through into consciousness. Blenkinsop 109, 110, A History of Prophecy in Israel. Isaiah 6, 6 through 7. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it, and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. This section corresponds to the unclean nature of Isaiah's lips. As he stated in Isaiah 6:5, the unclean must be purified, or in this case purged by fire. The coal held by tongs comes from the altar in the temple. This seems to be a divine fire that fails to be described by Isaiah's words. Calvin seems to attribute this moment to be an early iteration of sacraments and their mystery. This passage is fascinating, but I've talked about this passage for long enough. I'll continue with the other passage from Isaiah 6 in the future. Please be sure to check that out in the rest of my biblical criticism series. Thanks for watching and stay fantastic.